Alexander Hayes stood at the back of the ornate ballroom, nursing a crystal glass of scotch and surveying the wedding reception with detached interest. He'd built an empire worth billions before turning 35, but watching his efficient assistant Emily finally find happiness made him feel oddly empty. The dancing couples, the champagne toasts, the genuine laughter, it all served as a reminder of what his relentless pursuit of success had cost him. "You look about as thrilled to be here as someone scheduled for a root canal," a voice said beside him, warm with amusement. Alexander turned to find a woman in a deep emerald dress, her auburn hair falling in loose waves past her shoulders. Unlike the other guests who seemed intimidated by his presence, she met his gaze directly, one eyebrow raised in challenge. "I'm not particularly fond of weddings," he admitted, surprised by his own candor. "Yet here you are," she countered, looking exceptionally handsome in that tuxedo while radiating pure misery. A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Alexander Hayes," he offered, extending his hand. "Aria Kennedy," she replied, her handshake firm. "The perpetually single cousin of the bride." So this was Emily's cousin. He vaguely remembered Emily mentioning an Aria, a pediatric surgeon who had just moved back to the city after years abroad with Doctors Without Borders. Ah, the infamous doctor. "Kennedy, Emily speaks highly of you." Aria's eyes widened slightly. "And you're the demanding billionaire boss who nearly worked my cousin to death but somehow earned her unwavering loyalty." She tilted her head. "I've heard stories," Alexander winced, "not all flattering, I presume." "Let's just say I formed certain opinions before meeting you." Her smile softened the blow. "Though Emily insists you're not actually the soulless corporate tyrant you're rumored to be, high praise indeed," he said dryly. The wedding band transitioned to a slower number, and Alexander found himself strangely reluctant to end their conversation. "Would you care to dance, Dr. Kennedy? Only if you promise not to check your phone during it," she teased, setting down her champagne flute. As he led her to the dance floor, Alexander felt eyes following them. His presence at social events always drew attention, people curious about the reclusive billionaire who rarely appeared outside of business functions or financial publications. "So," Aria said as they began to move with the music, "Emily tells me you donated a small fortune to the Children's Hospital anonymously last year. Doesn't quite fit with the heartless tycoon image." Alexander's hand tensed slightly at her waist. "Emily talks too much." "Only to family," Aria assured him. "Your secret philanthropy is safe with the Kennedys." They moved together with surprising ease. Alexander hadn't danced in years, yet with Aria it felt natural. "Why anonymously?" she pressed, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Charity becomes theater when attached to a name like mine," he said after a moment. "I prefer the focus to remain on the cause, not the contributor." Aria studied him with new interest. "That's unexpectedly principled. You sound disappointed." "Were you hoping to confirm I'm as terrible as you imagined?" "On the contrary," she said, her green eyes sparkling with something he couldn't quite name. "I find myself intrigued by the contradiction." The song ended too quickly. Alexander reluctantly stepped back, already missing the warmth of her presence. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Hayes." "Alexander," he corrected, surprising himself again. "Alexander," she repeated, and something in the way she said his name made his chest tighten. "Enjoy the rest of the wedding. Try not to look so tortured the photographer might capture it for posterity." With that, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing alone on the dance floor feeling oddly off balance. Alexander spent the next hour mechanically engaging in obligatory conversations with Emily's family members and colleagues who recognized him. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to Aria Kennedy. She was unlike anyone in his usual social circles, direct, unimpressed by his wealth, and possessing a quiet confidence that spoke of a life defined by purpose rather than ambition. He was contemplating a discreet exit when the bride herself appeared at his side. "You came," Emily said, beaming up at him. I honestly wasn't sure you would. I promised, didn't I? He replied. Besides, I couldn't miss seeing the woman who's kept my life organized for 5 years find her happiness. Emily squeezed his arm affectionately. Thank you for the ridiculously generous gift. David nearly fainted when I told him you gave us the beach house in Malibu. Alexander shrugged. It was sitting empty. Better it goes to someone who'll appreciate it. I met your cousin, he added, attempting casual indifference. Emily's smile turned knowing. Aria, I saw you two dancing. She's brilliant, isn't she? She's forthright. That's diplomatic coming from you, Emily laughed. She's the only person in my family who wasn't intimidated by the prospect of meeting the Alexander Hayes. I'm not that intimidating, he protested. Emily gave him a look that clearly communicated her disagreement. You made 3 senior executives cry last quarter. They presented a strategy that would have cost 200 people their jobs while padding executive bonuses, Alexander said, his jaw tightening at the memory. They deserved worse than tears. And that, Emily said, patting his arm, is why, despite your terrifying reputation, I've stayed loyal to you for 5 years. Beneath that cold exterior beats the heart of a surprisingly decent human being. She glanced over his shoulder. Speaking of decent humans, there's Aria again. You should talk to her more, you might actually like each other. Before Alexander could respond, Emily was whisked away by her new husband, leaving him contemplating her words. He turned, scanning the crowd until he spotted Aria near the terrace doors, seemingly seeking a moment of quiet away from the celebration. Making a decision, Alexander moved toward her. As he approached, he noticed her slip outside onto the terrace. Following her out into the cool evening air, he found her leaning against the stone balustrade, gazing up at the stars. Escaping the chaos, he asked, coming to stand beside her. Aria turned, surprise flickering across her face before she smiled. Just taking a breather. Weddings are beautiful, but all that concentrated joy can be exhausting after a while. Alexander chuckled. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. Plus, she added, I've had 3 different relatives ask when it's going to be my turn, and I was contemplating how many more times I can politely change the subject before I start inventing fictional fiancés. The burden of being the single cousin at a wedding, Alexander said. Though I'm surprised someone hasn't snatched you up already. The moment the words left his mouth, he wanted to retract them. It was unlike him to speak so impulsively. To his relief, Aria didn't seem offended. My life hasn't exactly been conducive to relationships. Medical school, residency, then 3 years with Doctors Without Borders in crisis zones. Not many men are understanding about girlfriends who disappear to remote locations for months at a time. Their loss, Alexander said simply. Aria studied him with those perceptive green eyes. What about you? I find it hard to believe the eligible bachelor billionaire hasn't been claimed. Alexander leaned against the balustrade, looking out over the hotel's manicured gardens. Relationships require time and vulnerability. I've never been particularly good at offering either. That's remarkably self-aware. Don't sound so surprised, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting. I'm aware of my deficiencies. I wouldn't call them deficiencies, Aria mused. More like choices. We all make them, prioritizing certain aspects of life over others. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the muffled sounds of celebration from inside and the gentle splashing of a nearby fountain. So, Alexander said finally, now that you're back in the country permanently, what's next for Dr. Kennedy? I start at Metropolitan Children's Hospital next month, pediatric surgery department. That's where your donation went last year? Yes, Aria smiled. Small world, isn't it? Your money is funding the new pediatric intensive care wing where I'll be working. Alexander felt an unexpected warmth at the connection. I'm glad to hear it's being put to good use. It is, she assured him. Though I'm curious why children's medical care, of all the causes a billionaire could support, why that one? Alexander hesitated. He rarely spoke of his personal history. keeping the painful parts carefully compartmentalized away from his public persona. But something about the quiet night and Aria's genuine interest made him want to answer honestly. "My younger sister had leukemia when we were children," he said, his voice low. "We didn't have much money and my parents nearly bankrupted themselves trying to save her." Aria's expression softened. "I'm so sorry, did she?" "She survived, thankfully. She's a teacher in Oregon now with 3 kids of her own." He smiled faintly. "But I never forgot what it was like, the fear, the helplessness, watching my parents count pennies to afford treatments." "So you ensure other families don't face those same impossible choices," Aria said, understanding in her voice. That's actually beautiful, Alexander." The way she said his name made something shift in his chest. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Alexander felt an unfamiliar tension, not unpleasant, but charged with possibility. The spell was broken by Aria's phone chiming. She glanced down at it apologetically. "It's my mother. Apparently I'm needed for some family photos." "Of course," Alexander said, stepping back. "It was nice talking with you, Aria." She hesitated, then pulled a business card from her small clutch. "In case you ever want to see your investment in action," she said, offering it to him. "I give excellent tours of pediatric surgical facilities." Alexander accepted the card, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I might take you up on that." Aria smiled one last time before disappearing back into the reception, leaving Alexander alone with thoughts he hadn't entertained in years, thoughts of possibility, connection, and the unsettling realization that for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely interested in someone. 3 days later, Alexander found himself sitting in his penthouse office, Aria's business card between his fingers. He had picked it up and put it down at least a dozen times, debating whether to call her. It was ridiculous, this hesitation. He made billion-dollar decisions without blinking, yet the prospect of calling a woman he'd met at a wedding had him second-guessing himself like a teenager. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes, your 3 o'clock is here," his temporary assistant announced. With Emily on her honeymoon, he was making do with a rotation of substitutes from the executive pool, none of whom possessed Emily's intuitive understanding of his needs. "Send them in," he responded, tucking Aria's card back into his wallet. The meeting dragged on for nearly 2 hours, a potential acquisition that would expand Hayes Industries' technological capabilities, but required careful navigation of regulatory concerns. By the time the executives left, Alexander felt the familiar tension headache building at his temples. He loosened his tie and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Somewhere out there, Aria Kennedy was preparing to start her new position at Metropolitan Children's Hospital. The thought made the sprawling cityscape seem suddenly smaller, more intimate. Alexander pulled out his phone and Aria's card before he could overthink it again. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Dr. Kennedy." "Aria, it's Alexander Hayes." A brief pause. "Alexander, this is unexpected." "Is it a bad time?" "Not at all," she replied, her voice warming. "I'm just finishing up some credentialing paperwork for the hospital, riveting stuff." "I was wondering if you'd be free for dinner this week," he said, cutting to the chase, "to continue our conversation." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date, Alexander?" Her directness caught him off guard, though he should have expected it by now. "Yes," he admitted. "I am." "Good," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I'd like that. Thursday works for me." They made arrangements to meet at an upscale restaurant known for its privacy, and Alexander hung up feeling lighter than he had in days. Thursday evening arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation. Alexander found himself checking his watch repeatedly as his driver navigated through rush-hour traffic. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuine nervousness before meeting someone. When he arrived at the restaurant, Aria was already seated at their table. She wore a simple navy dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was pulled back in an elegant updo. As he approached, she looked up from the menu and smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "You're exactly on time," she noted as he sat down. "Emily always said punctuality was your religion." "One of many admirable qualities," he replied with a small smile, along with modesty, clearly. The waiter appeared to take their drink orders, and the initial tension eased as they fell into conversation. Aria told him about her years abroad, the challenges and rewards of practicing medicine in resource-limited settings, the children she'd treated, the perspective it had given her. "It must have been difficult," Alexander said, genuinely impressed. "Most people wouldn't voluntarily leave a prestigious position for such hardship." Aria considered this as she sipped her wine. "It never felt like a sacrifice to me, more like a privilege. Not everyone gets to directly use their skills to help others in such a tangible way." "I understand that sentiment more than you might think," Alexander admitted. "Though my methods are admittedly more removed." "Are they?" Aria tilted her head. "From what Emily's told me, you're quite hands-on with your company's charitable foundation." Alexander made a mental note to speak with Emily about the extent of her disclosures upon her return. "I try to ensure the money goes where it's most needed." "That matters," Aria said simply. "Intent matters." As dinner progressed, Alexander found himself sharing more than he had initially planned about his childhood in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston, his sister's illness, how it had shaped his drive to succeed. In turn, Aria told him about growing up with Emily, their close-knit extended family, and her early fascination with medicine after breaking her arm climbing a tree at age 8. "The orthopedic surgeon let me watch while he set my cast," she recalled. "Instead of being frightened, I was fascinated." Poor Emily fainted when I described it to her in detail afterward. Alexander laughed, finding it easy to picture a young Aria, curious and fearless even then. By the time they finished dessert, a chocolate soufflé they agreed to share, Alexander realized he'd enjoyed himself more than he had in years. There was something refreshing about Aria's company, her lack of pretense, her genuine interest in his thoughts rather than his wealth or influence. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they stepped outside, the cool night air a pleasant contrast to the restaurant's warmth. "I had a wonderful time." "As did I," Alexander replied, surprised by how much he meant it. They stood facing each other, that same charged tension from the wedding night returning. Alexander hadn't planned beyond dinner, unsure if she would even enjoy his company enough for anything further. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" he found himself asking. "There's a park just down the block." Aria smiled. "I'd like that." They strolled through the small urban park, surprisingly peaceful despite the city's constant hum around them. Their conversation continued effortlessly, touching on books they'd read, places they'd traveled, the strange parallel paths that had somehow led them to this moment. "Emily will be insufferably smug when she finds out about this," Aria commented as they completed a circuit of the park. "About what exactly?" Alexander asked, though he knew perfectly well what she meant. "This," Aria gestured between them. "Us having dinner, walking in the moonlight, all very romantic comedy material." "Is that what this is?" he asked, stopping to face her. "A romantic comedy." Aria met his gaze steadily. "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out." The honesty in her voice struck him. No games, no hidden agendas, just straightforward interest. "So would I," Alexander admitted. When he kissed her, it felt both impulsive and inevitable, a perfect moment of clarity in a life that had become predictably structured. Aria responded with equal warmth, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they parted, her eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if savoring the sensation. "Well," she said softly when she opened them, "that certainly clarifies things." Alexander smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Would you allow me to see you again, perhaps this weekend?" "I would," Aria replied. "Though I should warn you, I'm helping Emily's parents move into their new condo on Saturday. It's a family affair." "Sunday then," Alexander suggested. "I'll plan something special." As he arranged for his driver to take Aria home, Alexander realized with some surprise that for the first time in memory, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business or achievement. It was a novel sensation anticipation unmixed with strategic calculation or profit projections. "Good night, Alexander," Aria said, pausing before getting into the car. "Thank you for taking a chance." As he watched the car drive away, Alexander wondered if it was truly chance that had brought them together, or something else entirely, something his pragmatic mind hesitated to name, but his long dormant heart already recognized. The following weeks unfolded in a way that transformed Alexander's carefully structured life. Sunday became their day. He took Aria sailing on his yacht, to a private viewing at an art museum, hiking in the mountains outside the city. Each encounter revealed new facets of her that only deepened his growing feelings. She was brilliant but unpretentious, ambitious but compassionate, serious about her work but quick to laugh at herself. She challenged him constantly, questioning his perspectives and pushing him to reconsider long-held positions on everything from healthcare policy to the best way to cook pasta. "You can't just throw money at problems and expect them to disappear," she argued during one particularly heated discussion about urban development projects. They were sitting on the terrace of his penthouse, the remains of dinner between them. Communities need voices in the process. "I agree in principle," Alexander countered, "but stakeholder engagement slows progress. Sometimes efficiency requires decisive action." "At what cost, though?" Aria pressed, leaning forward intently. "The most efficient solution isn't always the most humane." Her words stayed with him long after she'd left that evening. The next morning, he called a meeting with his development team and ordered a complete revision of their approach to the neighborhood renewal project they'd been discussing. Emily returned from her honeymoon to find her boss subtly changed, still demanding excellence, still formidable in the boardroom, but somehow more present, more willing to consider perspectives beyond the bottom line. "So," she said, setting a stack of contracts on his desk one afternoon. "You and my cousin," Alexander looked up from his computer. "Is this the part where you warn me not to hurt her?" Emily smiled. "Aria can take care of herself, always has. I'm more concerned about you, actually." "Me?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because Aria doesn't do anything halfway," Emily explained. "If she's investing in this relationship, she's all in, and I've never seen you all in on anything except this company." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Alexander had built his life around calculated risks, never committing more than he could afford to lose, whether in business or personal matters. "She's different," he admitted quietly. Emily's expression softened. "I know. That's why I'm not warning you away, despite your terrible track record with relationships. Just be honest with her. About everything. Aria values truth above all else." The advice echoed in Alexander's mind as he prepared for Aria's arrival that evening. They had planned a quiet dinner at his penthouse. She'd insisted on cooking after discovering he subsisted primarily on restaurant deliveries and meals prepared by his housekeeper. When she arrived, arms full of grocery bags and her hair wind-blown from the walk from the parking garage, something shifted in Alexander's chest. The sight of her in his home, so vibrant and real among the sleek, impersonal decor he'd never bothered to personalize, made him realize how empty the space had been before. "Fair warning," she said, setting the bags on his kitchen counter. "I'm an experimental cook, results not guaranteed." "I trust you," he replied, and was surprised to realize how completely he meant it. They moved around his kitchen together, Aria directing him to chop vegetables and stir sauces while she handled the more complex aspects of the meal. It was domestic in a way Alexander had never experienced, comfortable, intimate, filled with casual touches and shared laughter. Over dinner, Aria told him about her first week at the hospital, the challenges she'd encountered, the children she'd already connected with, her plans for implementing new surgical techniques she'd learned abroad. "There's this one patient," she said, her eyes lighting up, "a 7-year-old boy with a congenital heart defect. Everyone said his case was too complex, but I know we can help him. I just need to convince the hospital board to approve the procedure." "What's stopping them?" Alexander asked. "Cost, mainly. It's experimental, requires specialized equipment," she sighed. "The usual barriers." Alexander hesitated, then made a decision. "What if those barriers disappeared?" Aria set down her fork. "What do you mean? What if Hayes Foundation funded the procedure, and any others like it?" She studied him carefully. "Alexander, that's incredibly generous, but I don't want you to feel obligated because of our relationship." "It's not obligation," he assured her. "It's alignment. You said it yourself, intent matters. My intent has always been to make meaningful change where I can. This fits perfectly within the Foundation's mission." Aria reached across the table to take his hand. "You're full of surprises, Alexander Hayes. Only recently," he admitted. "Only with you." Later that night, as they stood on his terrace overlooking the city lights, Alexander found himself contemplating a future he'd never seriously considered before, one that included sharing his life completely with someone else. "What are you thinking about?" Aria asked, leaning against him. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one Emily calls your calculating global domination expression." Alexander laughed. "Nothing so ambitious. I was thinking about us, actually." Aria turned to face him fully. "That sounds serious." "It is," he acknowledged. "These past weeks with you have been transformative, for me too," she said softly. "I've spent my entire adult life building walls," Alexander continued, taking both her hands in his. "Protecting myself, compartmentalizing emotions, keeping people at a calculated distance. It worked well for business, not so well for living." Aria squeezed his hands encouragingly but remained silent, giving him space to find the words. "Then you appeared at that wedding," he said, "completely unimpressed by my wealth or reputation, challenging me from the very first moment. And suddenly, all those carefully constructed walls seemed pointless." "Alexander, please let me finish," he said gently. "I need to say this while I have the courage." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you, Aria. I think I started falling that first night on the terrace at Emily's wedding, and it terrifies me because I've never felt this vulnerable before." Aria's eyes glistened in the soft light. "Vulnerability isn't weakness," she whispered. "It's courage. And for what it's worth, I'm falling in love with you too." Alexander pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "Where do we go from here?" "Forward," she answered simply. "Together." When he kissed her this time, it felt like sealing a promise, one more meaningful than any business contract he'd ever signed. 6 months later, Alexander stood in a private room at Metropolitan Children's Hospital, watching through a window as Aria spoke with a young patient and his parents. The newly completed Pediatric Intensive Care Wing, now officially named the Hayes Foundation Wing, had already treated dozens of children who might otherwise have had nowhere to turn. Aria looked up and caught his eye, smiling briefly before returning her attention to her patient. The simple gesture warmed him through. In the months since they'd begun their relationship, Alexander had discovered a capacity for joy he hadn't known he possessed. Emily approached, clipboard in hand. She had recently taken on a part-time role coordinating between Hayes Industries and the hospital foundation, allowing her more flexibility with her new marriage while maintaining her connection to Alexander's business interests. "The board is thrilled with the program's success," she informed him. "The patient outcomes are exceeding projections." "Aria's the reason for that," Alexander said, pride evident in his voice. "Her surgical innovation program is revolutionary." Emily studied him with amusement. "You know, when I invited you to my wedding, I never imagined you'd end up practically becoming family." "Life is unpredictable that way," Alexander acknowledged. "Are you happy?" Emily asked, more serious now. Alexander considered the question. 6 months ago, He would have measured happiness in terms of achievement, acquisitions, market share. Now, watching Aria do the work she loved, knowing she would return to the home they increasingly shared, thinking of the future they were building together, the answer was simple. Completely, he said, later that evening as they walked hand in hand through the park where they'd shared their first kiss. Alexander felt a rare sense of perfect contentment. "You're quiet tonight," Aria observed. "Just thinking," he replied, "about how attending a wedding I didn't want to go to changed my entire life." Aria laughed. "Funny how that works. One moment you're just Emily's intimidating boss who donated a wing to my hospital, the next you're the man I wake up beside every morning." They stopped at a fountain in the center of the park, its waters illuminated by soft lights. Alexander turned to face her, suddenly certain about what he needed to do. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Aria looked surprised as he withdrew a small velvet box. "Alexander." He opened it to reveal a ring, elegant, distinctive, with a center diamond surrounded by smaller emeralds that matched the color of her eyes at the wedding when they'd first met. "I had this whole speech prepared," Alexander admitted, "about how you've transformed my understanding of what matters, how you've taught me that true wealth has nothing to do with financial assets. But standing here now, it all comes down to something much simpler." He took her hand. "I love you, Aria Kennedy. I want to build a life with you, one filled with purpose and joy and all the messy, beautiful complications that come with loving someone completely. Will you marry me?" Tears sparkled in Aria's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Absolutely yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Alexander thought about the unlikely path that had led them here, how his reluctant attendance at his assistant's wedding had unexpectedly delivered him to the love he'd never believed he would find. 1 year later, they celebrated their own wedding in the garden of the house. They had purchased together a home that combined his appreciation for architecture with her love of warmth and color. Emily, serving as Aria's maid of honor, delivered a toast that had the guests laughing and Alexander pretending to scowl. "To the couple that proves opposites not only attract but thrive," she concluded, raising her glass. "And to my cousin, who accomplished what I thought impossible, making Alexander Hayes believe in something more valuable than his business empire." As Alexander pulled his new wife closer for a kiss, he silently thanked whatever twist of fate had placed him in that ballroom on that particular night, watching from the shadows until Aria Kennedy stepped into his life and showed him what it meant to truly live.